At 2200 hours on April 13, 1945, Corporal Léo Major was concealed within a drainage culvert 200 yards from Zwolle in the Netherlands. He observed German sentries patrolling a town he had been assigned to liberate, with only one other soldier acutely aware that this undertaking would likely cost them both their lives. He was 23 years of age, had 18 months of combat experience, and possessed but one functioning eye. Intelligence indicated approximately 90 German soldiers occupied the municipality. 50,000 Dutch citizens were trapped within its confines. The Canadian First Army intended to bombard Zwolle at dawn with artillery, razing every structure if deemed necessary, and eliminating any German or Dutch individuals who posed an obstruction. This was the standard procedure for liberation: reduce cities to rubble, then sort through the survivors. However, Major's commanding officer had issued a distinct directive: reconnoiter the German positions and report back, allowing the artillery to carry out the extermination. Major, however, harbored different intentions. The initial casualty of that night was Private Willie Arsenault, Major's partner and spotter. They had served together since their engagement in Normandy. Arsenault had twice saved Major's life, once in Caen and again in Scheldt. They had pledged to each other that they would both return home to Quebec after the war. At 22:15 hours, a German machine gun emplacement commenced firing from a church steeple 300 yards into the town. Arsenault was adjusting his compass when the initial volley struck him, 8 rounds, from an MG-42 firing 7.92 millimeters ammunition. He was deceased before Major could reach him. Arsenault was 20 years old, hailing from Montreal, and was betrothed to a young woman named Marie, who was employed in a munitions factory. Their wedding was scheduled for June. If these accounts resonate with you, please indicate your appreciation by liking and subscribing. These historical narratives merit remembrance. Major knelt beside Arsenault's fallen form for 30 seconds. Then he arrived at a resolution that contravened every regulation within the Canadian Army's field manual. He would not be conducting reconnaissance and submitting a report. He would not permit the artillery to obliterate this town. Instead, he resolved to enter Zwolle by himself and induce the Germans into believing that the entire Canadian First Army was launching an assault. One man, one eye, one night. 50,000 civilians remained oblivious to the fact that they were on the cusp of salvation. Major had sustained the loss of his right eye 8 months prior during the Normandy landings. A phosphorus grenade had detonated in close proximity to his face in Scheldt. The concussion had obliterated his eye and inflicted severe burns on the right side of his visage. The Army physicians recommended repatriation and a medical discharge, expressing gratitude for his service. Major declined, asserting that a single eye was sufficient for dispatching Germans. He remained engaged in combat, continuing the fight. Now, he found himself outside Zwolle, armed with one eye, a single rifle, and a strategy that defied all logic. To infiltrate an occupied town and initiate a fusillade, generating sufficient commotion to persuade the Germans that they were under attack by hundreds of soldiers. This would compel them to either engage in combat or retreat. He intended to execute this before the advent of dawn, thus preventing the artillery's intervention. The odds were astronomically unfavorable. One individual against 90 German combatants within an unfamiliar urban environment at night, impaired by monocular vision and diminished depth perception. Yet, Major had acquired invaluable knowledge during his 18 months of active service. Armies harbored a profound fear of noise, of pandemonium, and of the uncertainty surrounding the numerical strength of opposing forces. If he could generate sufficient auditory disruption and foster widespread confusion, the Germans might succumb to panic, might flee, and might abandon the town without firing a single shot. It was an audacious, suicidal endeavor entirely contrary to orders. Major inspected his Sten gun. 32 rounds resided in the magazine with 6 spare magazines. He carried 4 grenades and a knife. He cast a final glance at Arseno's deceased body. Subsequently, he rose and commenced his trek towards Zwolle. At 22:30 hours on April 13, 1945, Corporal Léo Major entered an enemy-held town solo, embarking on what would become the most audacious one-man liberation of the Second World War. The German forces were entirely unaware of the impending confrontation. The thoroughfares of Zwolle were deserted. No civilians were visible, no movement stirred, only the pervasive darkness and the scent of coal smoke emanating from German field kitchens somewhere deeper within the urban expanse. Major navigated along the eastern periphery, remaining ensnared in shadows, meticulously counting structures and committing the street layouts to memory. He recognized the imperative to comprehend the town's configuration before initiating hostilities. Zwolle was a venerable Dutch settlement, characterized by narrow passageways, edifices of stone, and canals bisecting its heart. Church spires punctuated every major crossroads, presenting an ideal defensive posture, offering 100 concealed positions for German soldiers and 1,000 vantage points for machine gun nests. A single misstep could lead Major into a deadly crossfire, dismembering him. His sole advantage lay in the Germans' ignorance of his approach. At 22:45 hours, Major identified his inaugural target, a German supply depot situated at the intersection of Dieser Straat. 2 sentries stood guard outside, casually smoking cigarettes, their rifles slung over their shoulders, utterly unprepared for any threat. Major raised his weapon and unleashed a 3-round burst from a distance of 40 yards. Both soldiers collapsed. He promptly hurled a grenade through the depot's window. The ensuing explosion illuminated the entire street. Ammunition within the building began to detonate, resulting in sporadic gunfire in indeterminate directions, encompassing small arms and possibly mortar rounds. The cacophony was overwhelming. Major retreated, sprinting 3 blocks northward. He halted at another intersection and discharged his Sten gun into the air, expending 10 rounds in short bursts. Subsequently, he lobbed another grenade at a German transport vehicle parked adjacent to what appeared to be a command post. The truck's fuel tank ruptured, igniting a conflagration that shot flames 30 feet into the air. He then resumed his rapid movement. The linchpin of Major's strategy was perpetual motion. He was determined never to remain stationary, thereby preventing the Germans from pinpointing the origin of the assault. He would discharge his weapon from the east and then withdraw to the north. From the north, he would proceed westward, creating the illusion of Canadian soldiers being ubiquitous, instilling the belief that the entire town was encircled. By 2300 hours, Major had engaged 6 German installations, 2 supply depots, 1 command post, and 3 machine gun nests. He had expended approximately 80 rounds in total, deployed 4 grenades, and accounted for perhaps a dozen German fatalities. The remaining enemy combatants had dispersed, and the town was beginning to stir. German soldiers were now racing through the streets, issuing commands in German, fortifying defensive positions, and firing erratically into the darkness at unseen targets. Officers were vociferously ordering their men to maintain their positions, to cease their panic, and to recall their training. However, their training had not encompassed such a scenario. Standard tactics dictated that attacks originated from a singular direction, with clearly defined objectives and artillery support. Their training did not account for a lone individual hurtling through their town, deploying explosives and vanishing before they could retaliate. Major replenished his Sten gun's magazine. 3 magazines remained, along with 2 grenades. He had been within the town for 25 minutes, successfully perpetuating the impression of a company-sized enemy force, possibly larger. The reverberations from the ammunition depot were still echoing off the structures. The truck continued to burn, and gunfire erupted from numerous locations as German soldiers engaged spectral threats. Nevertheless, Major encountered a significant impediment. His ammunition was dwindling, and he had traversed only approximately a third of the town. Several German positions remained unengaged. A contingent of soldiers had yet to succumb to panic, and officers persisted in attempting to organize a defense. He recognized the necessity of a more decisive action, something that would completely shatter German morale and compel them to abandon Zwolle without a single artillery shell being fired by the Canadians. At 23:15 hours, Major's attention was drawn to the Gestapo headquarters, a 3-story edifice situated near the town's core. Nazi banners adorned the windows, staff vehicles were parked outside, and lights blazed in every room, indicating it served as the command nexus for the entire German occupation contingent in Zwolle. Major assessed his remaining ordnance: 23 rounds, 2 grenades. This was insufficient for sustained engagement, but adequate for one final offensive. He began to advance towards the building, and it was at this juncture that he detected the presence of dogs, specifically German patrol dogs. At least 2, perhaps more. Their handlers' shouts could be heard somewhere behind him, accompanied by the growing ferocity of their barks. They had detected his scent. Major estimated he had approximately 90 seconds before the dogs would apprehend him. He sprinted toward the nearest structure, a bakery. Its windows were dark, and the door was secured. He shattered the glass with the butt of his rifle and clambered inside, sustaining a laceration to his left hand from the broken shards, blood trickling down his palm. Disregarding the injury, he pressed onward. Within the bakery, Major could hear the dogs outside scratching at the door and barking incessantly. Their handlers were close behind, their flashlights sweeping across the fractured window. German voices commanded him to surrender. Major retreated to the rear of the bakery, locating a secondary egress leading to an alley. He opened the door cautiously, surveying both directions. The alley was deserted. He slipped out and commenced a westward sprint. The dogs pursued. For the ensuing 15 minutes, Major led the German patrol on a relentless chase through Zwolle's eastern sector, navigating alleyways, vaulting fences, and traversing rooftops. The dogs maintained a close proximity, their panting audible, close enough that a pause exceeding 10 seconds would result in his capture. At 23:30 hours, Major reached a canal 20 feet wide, an impassable chasm for a standing jump. The dogs were 30 yards behind him, their handlers 40 yards distant. He could hear their shouts, urging him to halt, promising they would refrain from firing if he surrendered. Major surveyed the canal, then the dogs. He then plunged into the frigid water. The water's temperature in April in the Netherlands registered approximately 8 degrees Celsius. The sudden shock nearly arrested his heart. His uniform became saturated almost instantly. His Sten gun, having been submerged, might no longer function. His grenades, waterlogged, were unlikely to detonate. However, the dogs ceased their pursuit at the canal's edge. German shepherds typically exhibited an aversion to cold water and would not leap in without explicit command. The handlers reached the bank, raised their rifles, and discharged their weapons into the darkness where Major had vanished. They missed their target. Major hauled himself onto the opposite bank, shivering and sodden. His left hand continued to bleed from the glass laceration, his rifle potentially rendered inoperable, but he was alive. He consulted his wristwatch. 23:40 hours. He had been within the town for 70 minutes, had engaged 8 German positions, led a patrol on a pursuit that drew soldiers away from their defensive posts, generated chaos, created a significant disturbance, and accomplished precisely what he had intended. However, a more pressing concern now presented itself. His Sten gun was thoroughly saturated. He removed the magazine and ejected the chambered round. Water cascaded from the barrel. The firing mechanism was compromised, and the spring might be damaged. He would not ascertain its functionality until he attempted to fire it. And should it fail to operate, he would find himself isolated in the heart of an occupied town, armed with a defunct rifle and 2 waterlogged grenades. Major squeezed out as much moisture as possible from the magazine, reinserted it, chambered a round, aimed the Sten gun at the ground, and depressed the trigger. Nothing occurred, only a faint click. Either the firing pin was damp, the propellant within the cartridge had become saturated, or the mechanism was jammed. His rifle was rendered useless. Major possessed 23 rounds incapable of firing, 2 grenades with uncertain detonation capabilities, a solitary knife, 1 eye, and at least 70 German soldiers still within the town, now aware that a Canadian combatant was causing havoc somewhere within Zwolle. At 23:55 hours on April 13, 1945, Corporal Léo Major, thoroughly drenched and disarmed, stood in the center of an enemy-occupied town with no viable means of completing his mission. The Gestapo headquarters lay 6 blocks distant. Dawn was still 5 hours away, and his rifle remained inoperative. He required a new weapon, and he knew precisely where to procure one. The German patrol that had pursued him was armed with functioning rifles. Major simply needed to acquire one. He moved back towards the canal, maintaining a low profile, his sodden uniform emitting squelching sounds with each stride. The cold intensified, his teeth chattering uncontrollably, his hands growing numb. He had to act swiftly, lest hypothermia incapacitate him before the Germans could. At midnight on April 14th, Major spotted them. 3 German soldiers, part of the patrol that had been hunting him. They had divided to search both sides of the canal. These 3 were on Major's side, proceeding cautiously, their flashlights extinguished, rifles at the ready, scanning the darkness for him. Major concealed himself behind a stone wall, observing their approach. 20 yards, 15, 10. As the foremost soldier passed his position, Major sprang into action. He moved behind the soldier, encircling his throat with his left arm and pulling him backward. The soldier attempted to cry out, but Major's grip stifled the sound. The soldier dropped his rifle and clawed at Major's arm, struggling to break free and to draw breath. Major maintained his hold. The struggling soldier weakened, then became motionless. Major lowered him to the ground, unconscious, possibly deceased. He did not verify. The other two soldiers, alerted by the commotion, turned, raising their rifles. Major was already in motion. He seized the unconscious soldier's rifle, a Carabiner 98, standard German issue. It was a bolt-action weapon, holding 5 rounds in the magazine. Major worked the bolt and aimed at the nearest soldier. He fired. The soldier collapsed. The third soldier returned fire. The bullet struck the stone wall 6 inches from Major's head, sending stone fragments cutting across his face. Major worked the bolt, fired again, and missed. The German soldier fled. Major allowed him to escape. He now possessed a functional rifle. 4 rounds remained. That was sufficient. Major retrieved the deceased soldier's ammunition pouches and discovered 3 additional stripper clips, providing a total of 15 rounds. He also acquired 2 stick grenades, Model 24 German potato mashers with a 7-second fuse. He was familiar with their operation, having captured numerous such devices in Normandy. He was rearmed. At 12:15 a.m., Major resumed his offensive against Zwolle, proceeding towards the town center and the Gestapo headquarters. The building remained illuminated and occupied. Major could discern German officers through the windows, gathered around maps, strategizing their defense, attempting to ascertain the numerical strength of the Canadian forces assaulting their town. Major approached from the south, keeping to the shadows. The building was guarded. 4 soldiers, 2 positioned at the front entrance and 2 at the rear, all appeared agitated, scanning the darkness, anticipating an assault. Major obliged them. He hurled his first stick grenade at the front entrance. The detonation instantly killed both guards. Before the smoke dissipated, Major discharged his second grenade through a first-floor window. The explosion reverberated throughout the entire edifice. Glass shattered outwards. A scream emanated from within. Major then commenced firing his carabiner, expending his 5-round magazine at every illuminated window he could identify, reloading and firing another 5 rounds. The building's lights were extinguished. Shouts of command could be heard from within, ordering soldiers to return fire and hold their positions. Major heard the rapid tread of boots as German soldiers emerged from the building, approximately 20 individuals, comprising both officers and enlisted men, some armed with rifles, others solely with pistols. They were fleeing in disarray, abandoning the Gestapo headquarters under the mistaken impression that an entire Canadian company was launching an attack, a force they deemed insurmountable. Major permitted their retreat. His objective was not to engage fleeing combatants, but to generate maximum disruption, convince the Germans that Zwolle was lost, and compel them to abandon the town before daybreak. At 12:30 a.m., Major entered the Gestapo headquarters. The building was deserted. Maps remained spread across tables, coffee was still warm in cups, and radios crackled with German communications. The officers had fled with such haste that they had left everything behind. Major collected every document he could find: operational orders, troop dispositions, supply manifests, intelligence reports, and classified communications. He stuffed them into a canvas bag discovered near a desk. He then set the building ablaze. He poured gasoline from a jerry can onto the wooden furnishings, ignited a match, and watched the flames engulf the structure. Within 3 minutes, the entire ground floor was alight. Within 5 minutes, the fire had reached the second floor. By the time Major departed the building, flames were erupting from every window. The Gestapo headquarters burned for 2 hours, its smoke visible for miles. Every German soldier in Zwolle could see it and comprehend its significance. The command center was annihilated, the officers had fled, and the town was falling. Major checked his watch, 12:45 a.m. He had been in Zwolle for 2 hours and 15 minutes. He had destroyed the Gestapo headquarters, secured vital German intelligence documents, and eliminated or dispersed at least 30 enemy soldiers. However, 60 German troops remained within the town, and Major was running out of time. Dawn was still 4 hours away. If the Germans did not evacuate before then, the Canadian artillery would commence its bombardment, reducing Zwolle to ruins and claiming the lives of 50,000 Dutch civilians. Major reloaded his rifle. 10 rounds remained, no grenades. But he now possessed something more potent: momentum. He had instilled fear and precipitated an exodus among the Germans, and he was determined to maintain this pressure until their complete capitulation. At 1:00 a.m. on April 14, 1945, Major's progress halted upon hearing a distinct sound: voices. Dutch voices emanated from a building 30 yards ahead. Civilians were whispering, their tones laced with fear. Major approached cautiously and knocked on the door 3 times, paused, then knocked twice more, a resistance signal he had learned from Dutch underground operatives during the Scheldt operation. The door creaked open to reveal an elderly man, likely in his 60s, with white hair and a gaunt appearance, suggesting a prolonged period of deprivation. He scrutinized Major, taking in his sodden Canadian uniform, the German rifle he held, and the eye patch concealing his right eye. The man spoke in rudimentary English. "You are Canadian?" Major inclined his head in affirmation. "You are alone?" Major nodded again. The old man ushered him inside, secured the door, and led him to a basement where 30 Dutch civilians were taking refuge. Families, children, and elderly individuals, all gripped by terror, all anticipating the artillery barrage they knew would commence at dawn. A woman, perhaps 40 years old, stepped forward, her English more proficient than the old man's. "How many soldiers are with you?" "Just me," Major replied. A profound silence descended upon the room, all eyes fixed upon him. One woman began to weep. A child inquired something of his mother in Dutch, who hushed him. The English-speaking woman regarded Major with an expression of disbelief. "One man," she stated, her voice tinged with incredulity. "One man is making all this noise, the explosions, the fires, the shooting." "Yes," Major confirmed. "The Germans think you are hundreds of soldiers." "Good," she acknowledged, translating his words for the others. The room erupted into a cacophony of voices, some arguing, some laughing, some crying, and some viewing Major as either a hero or a lunatic, perhaps a confluence of both. Major, however, lacked the time for such deliberations. "Where are the German positions?" he inquired, seeking information on the soldiers who had not yet fled. The English-speaking woman produced a hand-drawn map. The Dutch resistance had been meticulously tracking German movements for weeks. She indicated 3 locations: a barracks on the western perimeter, a motor pool near the train station, and a machine gun emplacement at the primary bridge. "How many soldiers?" Major asked. "Perhaps 20 at the barracks, 10 at the motor pool, 5 at the bridge, 35 Germans, maybe 40. The rest have either fled, been eliminated, or are hiding somewhere you haven't discovered yet." Major studied the map. The barracks, situated 2 blocks to the west, was the closest. If he could assault it with sufficient force and volume, the remaining German contingent might falter completely, potentially abandoning Zwolle and sparing the town from artillery devastation. The woman grasped his arm. "You cannot do this alone. It is suicide." Major met her gaze. "I have been doing it alone for 2 hours. Why cease now?" He exited the basement and ascended to street level. The civilians watched his departure, some weeping, some praying, all cognizant that their very lives hinged upon the resolve of a partially blinded Canadian corporal who refused to yield. At 1:20 a.m., Major approached the German barracks, a repurposed school edifice comprising 3 stories, its windows boarded, sandbags reinforcing the entrance, and guards posted outside. Major observed activity within, soldiers packing equipment, preparing for evacuation. They were aware that the town was succumbing, but remained uncertain whether to fight or flee. Major made the decision for them. He walked directly towards the main entrance, fully visible, eschewing any attempt at concealment, advancing with an air of proprietorship, as if commanding 1,000 soldiers, as if the Germans had already conceded defeat. The guards sighted him, raised their rifles, and vociferously ordered him to halt. Major raised his carabiner 98 and discharged a round, striking the first guard in the chest. He worked the bolt and fired again, hitting the second guard in the head. Both soldiers collapsed. Major continued his advance. He arrived at the entry point, breached the door with a forceful kick, and stepped into a chamber where 18 German soldiers stood fixedly observing him. For 3 silent seconds, no one moved. The Germans' gaze was fixed on the Major. The Major returned their stare. Then a weapon was raised from within the building, and the situation erupted into pandemonium. The Major hurled himself to the side as the initial volleys of gunfire erupted. Rounds impacted the wall where he had just been standing, showering him with exploding plaster. He rolled behind a wooden desk, unleashed 2 shots over its top without aiming, purely to keep the Germans suppressed. He had 8 rounds remaining. The room descended into chaos. 18 German soldiers were scrambling, some grabbing their arms, others diving for cover, a few making a dash for a rear exit, officers barking commands, enlisted men shouting back. No one knew the origin of the hostile fire, nor the number of Canadians assaulting them. The Major exploited their disarray. He repositioned himself behind a filing cabinet and fired 3 times. 2 Germans fell. One cried out. The other remained silent. He now had 5 rounds left. A German soldier materialized to the Major's right. At close range, perhaps 8 feet away, his rifle was raised, finger poised on the trigger. The Major's weapon was spent. He couldn't reload fast enough. The German was about to shoot him point blank in the face. The Major flung his rifle at the assailant. The weapon struck the soldier in the chest, staggering him backward. In 2 strides, The major was upon him, drew his combat knife, and plunged it into the soldier's throat. The man choked, dropped his weapon, and collapsed. The major seized the fallen soldier's rifle, a different make, and loaded it. He confirmed 5 rounds in the chamber. He fired 3 shots into the ceiling, rapid bursts. Plaster rained down, filling the room with dust. The Germans began to cough, their vision and breathing impaired. The major navigated the dense dust cloud, locating the rear exit. He discharged his last 2 rounds at indistinct shapes in the gloom, then dashed outside. Behind him, the German barracks were in utter disarray. Soldiers streamed from every opening, some armed, others empty-handed, all running, fleeing into the night, abandoning their posts, their equipment, and Zwolle. The major counted them as they fled, 12, 14, 16. The majority of the garrison was heading west, toward German lines, toward safety, away from the solitary warrior they believed was razing their city. At 1:40 in the morning, the major stood outside the barracks and watched them depart. His ammunition was depleted once more. No rifle, no grenades, only his knife and the clothes on his back. Yet he had shattered the German defenses, dispersed the most significant enemy concentration remaining in Zwolle, and convinced them that the entire Canadian First Army was within the city. He glanced at his watch. 3 hours remained until dawn, 3 hours until the artillery barrage commenced. He needed to locate the remaining German strongholds, the motor pool, the bridge, and drive out the last of the enemy soldiers before sunrise. But first, he required more ammunition. The major re-entered the barracks. The structure was now deserted. Equipment lay strewn everywhere, rifles, ammunition, supplies. The Germans had fled with such haste that they had left everything behind. The major gathered what he required: an MP-40 submachine gun, the German standard issue, with a 32-round magazine, 3 spare magazines, 2 more stick grenades, a canteen of water, and some bread from a soldier's pack. He sat down and ate the bread, the first sustenance he had consumed in 12 hours. He drank the water, reloaded his magazines, and checked his weapons. His hands were steady, devoid of tremor or fear, only a cold, calculated assessment of the tasks ahead. At 2 in the morning, the major departed the barracks, heading for the motor pool. The night had grown quieter, the gunfire and shouting subsiding. The city was beginning to grasp that the Germans were withdrawing, that liberation was imminent, and that the artillery bombardment might be averted. However, the major could not cease his operations yet. Germans still occupied the motor pool, soldiers remained at the bridge, and men might yet regroup, attempt to reclaim the city, and force the Canadians to bombard Zwolle after all. The major reached the motor pool at 2:15. It was a fenced compound housing 6 trucks and 2 motorcycles. 4 guards stood watch outside, all visibly nervous, their attention drawn to the fires raging across Zwolle, each contemplating whether to remain or flee. The major made their decision for them. He opened fire with the MP-40 from a distance of 50 yards, unleashing a full automatic burst of 32 rounds in 4 seconds. The guards scattered. One fell, the others ran. The major reloaded and advanced toward the compound, lobbing a stick grenade over the fence. It landed near a fuel truck. The resulting explosion was colossal. The truck's fuel tank detonated, sending a fireball 30 feet into the air. The intense heat forced the major to retreat. The other trucks caught fire, one after another. Fuel tanks exploded, ammunition cooked off. transforming the entire motor pool into an inferno. Black smoke billowed into the night sky, visible for miles. Every German soldier still in Zwolle could see it, could comprehend its implications. The motor pool was gone. The vehicles were destroyed. There was no possibility of evacuating equipment, no means of reinforcing, no way to hold the city. At 2:30 in the morning on April 14, 1945, the major had been in Zwolle for 4 hours. He had neutralized the Gestapo headquarters, dispersed the main German barracks, incinerated the motor pool, and eliminated or routed more than 60 enemy soldiers. Only one objective remained: the bridge, defended by 5 German soldiers and 1 machine gun, the last enemy stronghold in Zwolle. Then, something unexpected occurred. A figure emerged from the darkness with his hands raised. It was a German officer, bearing captain's insignia, appearing to be around 35 years old, unarmed, approaching the major slowly with his hands elevated. Behind him, 8 more German soldiers, also unarmed, also walking with their hands raised. The major leveled his MP-40, aiming at the officer's chest. "Stop," he commanded. The officer halted and spoke in heavily accented English. "We surrender the city, all of it. We surrender to you." The major kept his weapon trained on the officer. "How many soldiers remain?" 14. "At the bridge. They will also surrender. I give you my word." "Your word doesn't mean much right now." The officer nodded. "I understand, but we know we cannot win. You have too many soldiers, too much support. We have been fighting all night, and you keep coming. We are surrounded. We are defeated." The major did not correct him. He did not reveal to the officer that there was only 1 Canadian soldier in Zwolle, that every explosion, every gunshot, every fire had been the work of a single, half-blind corporal who refused to let the city be annihilated, let the Germans believe they had been overwhelmed by an army, let them surrender with that misconception intact. "Take me to the bridge," the major instructed. The officer led the way, his men following. The major walked behind them, MP-40 at the ready, one eye scanning for threats, ambushes, or Germans unwilling to surrender. But the streets were now silent. The fires were dying down. The shooting had ceased. Zwolle was hushed, save for the sound of footsteps and the distant roar of the burning motor pool. They reached the bridge at 20 minutes to 3 in the morning. The remaining German soldiers were there, 14 men standing in formation, their weapons stacked on the ground, hands at their sides, awaiting orders. The officer turned to the major. "As I promised, they surrender, all of them. The city is yours." The major observed the German soldiers. They were young men, most of them younger than himself, visibly scared and weary, eager to go home, eager for the war to end. They had been instructed to defend Zwolle, to hold the bridge, to die if necessary. Instead, they were surrendering to what they perceived as an overwhelming Canadian force. The major lowered his weapon. "Walk west, all of you. Do not stop. Do not look back. If I see any of you in this city after sunrise, I will shoot you." The German officer nodded and issued an order in German. His men formed up and began their march west, towards German lines, towards whatever remained of the Wehrmacht in the Netherlands, away from Zwolle. The major watched them depart, counting 23 German soldiers, the last enemy troops in the city, walking away, surrendering without a fight, leaving 50,000 Dutch civilians alive, leaving Zwolle intact, and preventing an artillery bombardment that would have reduced the medieval city to rubble. At 3:15 in the morning on April 14, 1945, Corporal Léo Major stood alone on a bridge in Zwolle, Netherlands. Behind him lay a city he had liberated single-handedly. Ahead of him, 23 German soldiers marched into the darkness. Around him, fires blazed and smoke ascended, the tangible evidence of 4 hours and 45 minutes of the most audacious one-man operation in the history of World War II. He had accomplished it. He had saved the city, halted the artillery, and freed 50,000 people with one eye in one night, as one man who refused to let an entire city perish. The major sank onto the bridge, his legs finally buckling, the adrenaline ebbing and exhaustion crashing down on him all at once. He was soaked through, freezing, covered in blood, dirt, and gunpowder residue. He had been fired upon perhaps 100 times, chased by dogs, nearly drowned in a canal, engaged in hand-to-hand combat, and survived. He checked his watch. 3 hours remained until the Canadian artillery was scheduled to open fire. He needed to return to his lines and inform his commanders that Zwolle was liberated, that the Germans had surrendered, and that the 50,000 civilians were safe. But first, he needed to rest just for a minute, just long enough to allow his body to stop trembling. The major closed his good eye. The sun would rise soon. The city would awaken. The Dutch would learn they had been freed by a single Canadian soldier who had entered their occupied city and refused to leave until every German was gone. At 3:30 in the morning, Corporal Léo Major fell asleep on a bridge in Zwolle, still clutching his captured MP-40, still clad in his wet uniform, still missing his right eye, the most improbable liberator in World War II history. When he awoke 40 minutes later, members of the Dutch resistance were standing over him, dozens of them, gazing down at the Canadian soldier who had saved their city. And they were weeping. The Dutch resistance fighters assisted Major back to Canadian lines, provided him with dry clothing, fed him, and recounted their experiences from the night. They spoke of the explosions, the fires, the German soldiers fleeing through the streets, the sheer pandemonium. They had believed an entire Canadian First Army was attacking. They found it inconceivable that it was a single man. Major's commanding officer was also initially disbelieving, suspecting confusion, exaggeration, or the effects of exhaustion or shock. However, the Dutch resistance corroborated every detail. One Canadian corporal, one warrior, one liberated city, 93 German soldiers killed, captured, or driven out, 0 artillery shells fired, 0 civilian casualties, 50,000 lives saved. The Canadian Army entered Zwolle at 0600 hours on April 14, 1945. They had anticipated house-to-house combat, casualties, and resistance. Instead, they found nothing but abandoned German positions, discarded equipment, and thousands of Dutch civilians cheering in the streets, waving flags, crying, and celebrating their liberation. They inquired about the Canadian soldier who had saved them, asking for the one-eyed corporal who had entered their city alone. The Dutch wished to express their gratitude, to present him with flowers, to name streets in his honor. Major declined, informing his commanders that he sought no recognition, no parades, only the continued opportunity to fight, to perform his duty and to eliminate Germans until the war concluded. 3 weeks later, Germany surrendered, bringing the war in Europe to an end. Major returned to Quebec, to the logging town of his impoverished youth, the place where he had enlisted in the army to escape poverty, a place where no one knew of his actions in Zwolle. The Canadian Army nominated Major for the Distinguished Conduct Medal, the second highest military decoration Canada could bestow. Major had already received 1 DCM for his valor at Scheldt. Now, he was to receive another. Only 3 Canadian soldiers in World War II were awarded 2 Distinguished Conduct Medals. Léo Major was one of them. King George VI wished to present the medal personally at Buckingham Palace with full ceremony. Major refused, stating his dislike for the British, his lack of respect for King George, and his unwillingness to accept a medal from a monarch whose armies had allowed Dunkirk to happen and had permitted Canadian soldiers to perish on French beaches, while British commanders observed from offshore vessels. Consequently, the medal was mailed to him. Following the war, Major lived a quiet life, working as a pipe fitter and raising a family. He rarely spoke of Zwolle, never disclosing his wartime exploits to his children. When questioned, he offered brief responses. Yes, he had served in the war. Yes, he had lost an eye. No, he did not wish to discuss it. In 1970, the city of Zwolle extended an invitation to Major 25 years after its liberation. They desired to honor him, to express their profound gratitude, and to demonstrate the significance of his actions. Major accepted the invitation. The Dutch accorded him a hero's welcome. Thousands lined the streets. Children presented him with flowers. Elderly men who had been part of the resistance clasped his hand. Women who had sheltered in basements while he fought embraced him. The city officially named a street in his honor, Léo Majorland, a permanent tribute to the Canadian soldier who had saved them. Léo Major passed away on October 12, 2008, in Montreal. He was 87 years old. He had lived 63 years since that fateful night in Zwolle. 63 years as the man who had single-handedly liberated a city. The man who had proven that courage does not necessitate 2 eyes or 1,000 soldiers, but simply one individual's unwavering refusal to yield. His medals are now displayed at the Canadian War Museum in Ottawa, accompanied by a citation detailing his extraordinary feat. 1 night, 1 city, 93 Germans defeated, 50,000 civilians saved. The most improbable liberation in World War II history, the people of Zwolle still remember. Every year on April 14th, they gather at Léo Majorland, light candles, and recount tales of the Canadian corporal who entered their occupied city and refused to depart until every German had been expelled. They speak of the soldier who spared them from an artillery bombardment, of the man with 1 eye who perceived more clearly than anyone else what needed to be done. 93 enemy soldiers vanquished, 1 city liberated. 1 night that demonstrated impossibility was merely a synonym for difficulty. And 1 Canadian corporal who showed the world that sometimes 1 person is sufficient. The Germans could not comprehend it. The Dutch never forgot it. And history will forever recall the night Corporal Léo Major decided that 50,000 lives were worth risking his own. Thank you for watching and for cherishing these stories that deserve to be remembered. If this narrative moved you, I would be deeply grateful if you would click the like button and subscribe to help us share more histories like this. And please, leave a comment below telling us where in the world you are watching from. It means everything to know these stories are reaching people across the globe. Until next time, take care and remember the courage of those who came before us.